During the mid-1800s, Fairfax County was in the midst of an economic decline. The rich farming soil was exhausted from overplanting tobacco. Many farmers took their families and slaves and went further south. By the 1840s, new Yankee farmers were moving onto the land. Sarah Summers Clark said of the new Yankee farmers,
"These Northerners were different in manner and customs from the Southerners, and it was difficult for them to understand our way. We liked many of them and found they had a heart, even though it was not as big as a Southerner's."
All that was about to change. In April 1861, the South fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Fairfax, with its proximity to Washington, would be a crucial link in the conflict between North and South. There was fear that Washington might be captured, which could be the fatal blow to end the Union, militarily, politically, and psychologically. Historian Ed Bars explains.
If Confederate forces occupied Fairfax County, they would be a threat to the existence of Mr. Lincoln's government. At the same time, Fairfax, with a large landmass, important railroads passing through it, and roads, provide the ideal staging area for a Union advance into Virginia.
President Abraham Lincoln, unwilling to allow the South to secede from the Union, began assembling troops. Virginia joined the other southern states in voting on whether or not to secede from the Union. One citizen, Townsend Sisson, went to the Fairfax courthouse with the intention of voting in favor of preserving the Union. Before he could do so, he was intimidated by a warning from a state senator.
"May I suggest that you do not vote if you wish to enjoy continued good health?"
Sisson chose not to vote at all. At Baileys Precinct, citizens who voted against secession were forced to change their votes. In addition, they had to sign an oath that this change of heart was made under no duress. In the end, Fairfax County sided with the rest of the state, voting 932 to 289 for secession. Only the three precincts where Northern influence was heaviest, Accotink, Lewinsville, and in Vienna, Lydeckers, voted to remain with the Union. The terrible divisiveness of the Civil War was played out not only in the ballot boxes, but in the individual lives of families. Of the 8 children in Thomas Sisson's family, 5 supported the Union, and 3 the Confederacy. The most dramatic incident took place at Rose Hill, the Dulaney family residence on Franconia Road, where the elder Dulaney, a Union supporter, was captured by his very own son, one of Mosby's Rangers. While many families were taking sides, none of them anticipated a long war. On the 1st of June, 1861, Fairfax would see its first skirmish. In fact, it was to be the first skirmish of the Civil War. The Union cavalry rode up Main Street and were met at the Fairfax courthouse by the Warrenton Rifles, led by Captain John Quincy Marr. In the ensuing battle, Marr would be the first Confederate officer killed in the war. Another skirmish at Vienna followed, the first time a train came under attack in a war. Both fights would prove to be a preview of the devastation to come to Fairfax. President Lincoln ordered Brigadier General Irvin McDowell to march his troops from Washington to Manassas, where Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard occupied the railroad junction. On July 18, 1861, at the fords on Bull Run, the Confederates made a stand. McDowell's men were confident of victory. They anticipated pushing the Southerners all the way back to Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Union officers, so sure of victory, packed their dress uniforms in anticipation of a grand celebration. Jim Burgess, battlefield historian, explains.
At the time, many thought this would be the first, last, and only major battle of the war. Many politicians and civilians followed the Union Army out from Washington to watch what they thought would be the climactic event to a very short rebellion. The throng of civilians was so great, there was a shortage of horses and carriages around Washington. Many provisioned themselves with picnic baskets, as it was a good 8-hour ride from Washington to Centerville, where many observed the battle.
On the morning of July 21st, the Union Army opened the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, as it was called in the North, with a diversionary attack on the Confederate left at Stone Bridge. A Union soldier recalled,
"It was stifling hot. Not a breath of air was stirring. I can only recall that we stood there and blasted away. There was a wild uproar of shouting and firing. The faces nearly were inhuman. And through the smoke flashed a rebel musketry."
Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston had sent reinforcements to General Beauregard via train from the Shenandoah. This was the first time trains were used to transport troops for tactical purposes. The armies fought a pitched battle. In the midst of the heaviest fighting, one Southern brigade, led by Thomas Jackson, stood firm, refusing to retreat.
Later that afternoon, General Barnard Bee of South Carolina pointed to Jackson's line as he tried to rally some of his troops and shouted, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us rally on the Virginians."
The nickname stuck to General Stonewall Jackson, and his bravado helped inspire the Confederates and turned the tide to victory. A major in Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry wrote,
"I have no time to write the particulars of the battle. Can only say that it raged for hours with incarnate fury. The field battle after the fight presented the most awful sight you can imagine. At some point I found it difficult to ride among the dead without treading on them. Headless, mangled, dying. My God, what a sight. And what a sin." About 4, the enemy fled in utter confusion, leaving everything behind them.
The retreat was so haphazard that many soldiers ran right through people's houses. Sarah Summers Clark remembered the soldiers.
The roads and fields were soon filled with Union soldiers running like mad to get back to Washington. They were so scared they hardly knew which way they were running. There was a long hallway extending through our house from back to front. Many retreating soldiers ran pell-mell through the house like hunted animals trying to get away.
All in all, the Union suffered 1,500 dead and wounded. The Confederates lost 1,900 men, but won the day. General Beauregard wanted to take advantage of the Confederate victory and lead a full-scale pursuit into Washington. On October 1st, he and General Johnston met President Jefferson Davis at the Wilcoxon Tavern across from the Fairfax Courthouse. Beauregard's idea was scrapped as calmer heads prevailed. The defeat at Bull Run was not taken lightly by the Union. Lincoln ordered 68 forts to be built around Washington for the defense of the capital. 5 were located in the eastern part of Fairfax County. While the demoralized Union forces were regrouping, the flamboyant Confederate cavalryman, General Jeb Stuart, took Munson's Hill and Mason's Hill near Baileys Crossroads. These were to become the closest Confederate outposts to the city of Washington. President Lincoln was dismayed to see the Confederate flag flying from Munson's and Mason's Hills. From these vantage points, Stuart's men were able to train their telescopes on certain windows in Washington, where Confederate spies signaled strategic information on Union troop strength. In October, the Confederates, under General Johnston, fell back from the Baileys Crossroads area to Centerville in order to consolidate their lines. On November 20th, 1861, General George McClellan staged a grand review of the Union Army at Baileys Crossroads, an event designed to bolster sagging morale. The new Union Army was 50,000 men strong. With President Lincoln and the cabinet looking on, the Union forces spread across 200 acres of land. The sight of Union soldiers proved so inspiring that a young poet, Julia Ward Howe, wrote stirring new words to the familiar song John Brown's Body and created the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Little fighting occurred in the winter of 1861-62. The cold was the greatest enemy to Johnston's ill-fitted Confederate troops. The treacherous weather at Centerville proved devastating. Forests were depleted to build Confederate winter quarters. Farm supplies were confiscated. Sarah Summers Clark remembered,
"Our neighbors had their crops taken from them, and their pigs were in such demand they had to keep them in the house to prevent them from being stolen. Whenever the Union Army broke camp, there was a mad scramble by everyone, black and white alike, to see what they could find. Shoes were so scarce that people were glad to get a hold of a pair that some Union soldier had thrown away."
On December 20th, 1861, Drainesville saw the only action of the winter, which pitted Jeb Stuart against General Edward O.C. Ord. Ord brought wagons to collect hay from the southern farmers, but Stuart fought him at every turn, trying to save supplies from being confiscated. The skirmish, known as the Battle of the Hay Wagons, would be a harbinger of the fighting to come.
Disease killed more men than bullets during the Civil War. Typhoid, dysentery, and measles in particular killed many Confederates while encamped around Centerville during the first winter of the war.
A Union surgeon wrote to his family,
Dear parents, measles have continued to increase and have assumed an alarming degree of virulence. 16 men have died in the last 30 days. 3 have died today.
Disease spread to the civilian population. Sarah Summers Clark remembers.
My mother was sick with the measles. Every person on our place, black and white, had the measles, which they caught from the soldiers.
2 people die from disease for every one who dies of an injury received on the field of battle.
In March, the Union Army advanced on the Confederate fortifications in Centerville as the Southerners under Johnston moved across the Rappahannock. Amazingly, the Confederate cannons were revealed to be a sham. An unidentified Union soldier recalled,
"Some of the boys and I thought we would go up and see the wonderful fortification there. There was one large fort where there had been about 100 guns. And all around there were about 50 sham forts where the logs and stovepipes were put up to scare somebody."
The forts were protected by Quaker guns.
Quaker guns consist of tree trunks, cut off, positioned in the embrasures of earthworks to look like real cannon. They're Quakers because Quakers oppose war, but a Quaker gun could not harm a mouse.
In July, President Lincoln brought in John Pope to become commander of the Union's newly created Army of Virginia. Pope exaggerated wildly about his previous battles and cracked down hard on Southern sympathizers. Many were incarcerated in the old Capitol Prison in Washington. The Confederate Army, in turn, arrested many Northern sympathizers and sent them to Libby Prison in Richmond. Life was hard for everyone. General Robert E. Lee, seeing a window of opportunity to strike Pope, sent Stonewall Jackson around Pope's army. On August 26, 1862, Jackson cut Pope's line of supply and communications at Manassas Junction. Pope abandoned his positions on the Rappahannock River and sent his forces after Jackson. It had been a year and a month since the two armies met on the same battlefield at Manassas. The Second Battle of Manassas proved to be as disastrous for the Union Army as the first. Confederate troops held firm as the Union casualties began to mount. Even when they ran out of ammunition, Jackson's men continued fighting, pelting their enemies with stones. At Fairfax Station, 7 miles from Bull Run, Clara Barton arrived to tend the wounded. She described the scene to a friend.
The ground for acres was thinly wooded slope, and among the trees on the leaves and grass were laid the wounded, who were pouring in by the scores of wagon loads, as picked up on the field under the flag of truce. All day they came, and the whole hillside was covered. Bales of hay were broken open and scattered over the ground like littering for cattle, and the sore and starving men were laid upon it.
Barton treated the wounded and prepared to send them back on the train to Washington. She wrote of her war experiences.
You must never so much as think whether you like it or not, whether it is bearable or not. You must never think of anything except the need and how to meet it. I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it. While our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them.
Clara Barton became known as the Angel of the Battlefield and would later found the American Red Cross. The need for her services were great, as the Second Battle of Manassas produced more casualties than the first. The Confederacy suffered 9,000 dead and wounded, and the Union 10,000.
On September 1st, during a torrential afternoon thunderstorm, another battle was fought just outside Fairfax Courthouse. This proved to be the largest battle in Fairfax County. It is known as the Battle of Chantilly. In the South, it is sometimes called the Battle of Ox Hill. General Pope's forces were initially deployed around Centerville in strong positions, and General Lee sent Jackson around Pope's flank in an attempt to cut off General Pope's escape to Washington. This movement, however, was detected, and Union forces moved to intercept Jackson. The fighting at Chantilly proved to be a draw from a tactical standpoint. General Pope was eventually able to escape back to Washington. But the fighting at Chantilly cost the Union Army the loss of 2 of its best commanders. Generals Phil Kearny and Isaac Stevens were both killed in action.
After the Battle of Chantilly, the focus of the war moved from Fairfax. Lee took his troops north to Maryland, to a place called Antietam, and the bloodiest day in the Civil War. Jeb Stuart made a return visit to Fairfax in late December. At Burke Station, in what came to be known as the Christmas Raid, Stuart captured supply wagons, cut telegraph wires, tore up the railroads, and captured 200 prisoners. He had the audacity to wire the Union quartermaster, complaining of the poor quality of the mules he had taken.
They are scarcely strong enough to pull the wagons carrying the Union goods.
Colonel John Singleton Mosby served under Jeb Stuart before organizing Mosby's Rangers in 1863. He operated as an independent cavalry unit and made many successful raids behind Union lines, keeping the Confederacy's hopes alive. Spying on Union soldiers who were often quartered in Fairfax homes was a common occurrence. One Confederate spy, an attractive young lady named Antonia Ford, was no stranger to war. When Union troops invaded her home to loot, she cleverly charmed Union soldiers while hiding many of the family's valuables under her hoop skirt. She was so effective in supplying Jeb Stuart with information about Union troops that he awarded her a commission as a major and named her his honorary aide-de-camp. In March 1863, Union General Edward Stoughton went to a party in Fairfax. Antonia learned of the event from some of the guests who were staying at her house. After a night of partying, the general returned to his bedroom and fell soundly asleep. Shortly thereafter, he was jolted awake by a sharp slap on the rear end.
Have you ever heard of Mosby?
Mosby asked.
Yes, have you caught him?
General Stoughton replied.
No, but he has caught you.
Along with General Stoughton, Mosby captured 2 captains, 30 privates, and 58 horses. When told of Mosby's raid, President Lincoln was said to have remarked,
"I don't care much about the loss of a general, as I can make another with a stroke of a pen. But I sure hate to lose those horses."
Mosby's daring feats made him a living legend. He became known as the Gray Ghost. Many Union men actually admired him and wanted to learn more about him. A secret meeting was arranged one night for some of them to meet a few of Mosby's men at the home of Sarah Summers Clark. According to Sarah's sister, Mrs. Belle Holden,
Mother acted as hostess, and they talked in the friendliest manner possible. They told each other how much they regretted having to kill each other and be so cruel. Later, they left in peace, and no one ever knew they had met in our house.
Mosby's raids would effectively keep the war going another year. As the war drew to a close, Mosby disbanded his troops rather than have them surrender. In the end, the Union prevailed. There would be no separate Southern nation. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered. Mrs. Belle Holden's memories echo the bleak stories of many Southerners left in Fairfax County as the war ended.
I heard of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. For us, the world had fallen. We went back to our old home near Centerville, where we found only the hull of a house, ruined fences and devastated fields, and began with thousands of others, many of whom had fared much worse than we, the almost hopeless task of reconstructing the South.
The war left the once prosperous farming community of Fairfax totally devastated. The remaining population began the long process of recovering their lives from the ashes of war.
We are climbing Jacob.
Freed slaves, though poor and dislocated, would begin a period of readjustment to a political and economic status as free individuals. Some moved on to Washington and other cities of the North, and some stayed where they were and found work. Others were absorbed into the free black communities near Centerville and Chantilly that had existed since the 18th century. In the years to follow, Fairfax County would face the challenges of Reconstruction and the rebuilding of farms and families. Prosperity would return, but it would be a long time coming.